Hi, this is AJ Allegra, here with my final presentation for the difficult art of listening. And I'd like to start off by talking about probably the number one thing in this course that really made me think was the very first principle of ethnography, which is that concept of holism, the placing of a conversation or any sort of listening type event in its larger context. And I think that because I come from a background of theater, that for me, the context is everything. And I realized this in my interviews and in my simply self-observations that the spaces that we exist in, the listening spaces, as it were, within our organizations, within our personal lives, within our social lives, so inextricably are linked to the listening that occurs within them and the way that we're able to hear. Whether it be the environment of a theater space, such as when I was having a conversation with a prop designer, and it was a corrective conversation that we were having downstairs beneath the theater while a performance was going on, which made the dialogue between the two of us kind of quiet, more intense, and more closely, finely tuned, focused back and forth. How that affected it versus in my life as a teacher, when I'm in a room full of students, that happens, on an almost daily basis when I'm rehearsing something, and we're there in an atmosphere of it's 3:45 and students have just gotten out of their school classes and they're coming into the theater in droves with the energy and the hormones and basically just everything that they're carrying with them into a rehearsal space. And what a vastly different experience that can be to listen and to hear an entire ethnographic universe, as it were, of so many voices in one room, in a room that is so different from a backstage concept to a rehearsal room, to a boardroom, to a small, intimate office setting. I was really affected by the concept that it's the environment and the context that you are in that can truly affect the way that you can hear and listen to a conversation, and the effectiveness that the very communication that takes place in that realm can be enhanced or altered for the worse. The second concept of building rapport, I think is incredibly important, and especially for me, is that related to I came back a lot to things that our board did versus the way that our company operates. So my theater organization, the NOLA Project, basically exists in three spheres. We have staff, board, and company. And there's overlap in there, but the way that the board has a sort of the way that the board operates with one another compared to the way that the company communicates and listens to one another is so vastly different. And I try to be more of a objective kind of observer of those differences, as opposed to thinking one is better than the other. But ultimately, I recognize that the company, both in the context, the holism context of where the company meets in a more casual type environment versus a boardroom, a long table with 15 to 20 chairs around it and agendas laid out in front of each chair with little name tags. I realize that those two environments will affect the types of conversations that goes in there. And So the boardroom for me requires a much stronger rapport building if I'm to effectively listen and communicate within that environment. And so that's something that is very important to me about as an arts leader, about building and improving the relationship that I have with my board through building rapport as an effective use of ethnography. The third principle of the participant observation, this idea that, you don't want to be a fly on the wall. You can't be a fly on the wall because you're never truly invisible. And if you're going into any type of space where you're trying to kind of conduct an anthropological assessment of a culture, whether it be a culture that's deeply foreign to you or whether it be the culture of your own organization, you're there. You have to engage. You cannot simply stand in the corner and say, behave as if I'm not here, because that's impossible. So I think that, again, when I think about like the board meeting that we had where I conducted my first kind of listening experiment of seeing how people communicated in that small environment where we were trying to plan for a fundraiser and do some advisory board planning. But I have to recognize that I'm ineffective if I am to not be participating in that type of listening experiment, because it's my job. I'm as the artistic director, as the executive of the organization, it's my responsibility to not only be observant and try and listen with more of myself than just hearing, and try and listen with my body and take in the whole environment and building rapport, but it's also important that I be an active participant in that very listening experiment, as it were. We talked about interviews being dialogical, being more like a dialogue than just question and answer. And I think a lot about the way that we listen to those two different podcasts. We kind of thought about which podcast was more effective or less effective. And I think that for me, again, the context of those two podcasts was the difference. One had a longer time frame, a much larger ability to kind of let the conversation go where it leads, while the other one was a more focused, shorter time frame. Worked for a more mass media organization that tries to get out a higher volume of information as opposed to maybe a higher quality. So, for me personally, I think that in my one-on-one conversation that I had about EDI initiatives within our organization with my friend Lauren, I think that was very crucial to remember, that seeking her out for advice was something that was a dialogue. It was not a monologue on her behalf of speaking to me while I took notes. It was about me staying engaged and listening to everything that she had to say. And in the case of my own personal preference, I don't like to take notes when other people are speaking. I actually much prefer to kind of take everything in and then write down what was meaningful or what stuck with me afterwards. But I think, sometimes the note-taking can put up a barrier in between what could be effective dialogue. So just to point out that in that type of conversation, which we're discussing a very serious topic, the idea that an interview is a two-way street is a very important one. Thinking about the fifth concept of everyone being an ambassador for their cultural world made me think a lot about the very first video we watched, the Ernesto Saroli's video about him going to Africa and saying that everything that they touched died on their first pass through because the Africans, in the case of his personal experience, they are cultural ambassadors for their world, but he is also a cultural ambassador for his world of Italy, and he was going into it without really acknowledging the differences of those two things and allowing those differences to more organically shape the changes that were going to actually affect those communities in good ways. Without listening to them about why they wouldn't plant crops in a certain area, and then the hippos would come and eat everything. They just went in kind of with, I would say with blinders, but almost with earmuffs on, as opposed to understanding that everyone is the cultural ambassador for their world, both your own and the subject that you're observing. And then the idea of identity, that people tell you who they are in every exchange, that's something that I just see in an organization every day. As an artistic director who manages a company of 34 artists, I have to be pretty consistently cognizant that different artists require different feedback. They require different listening. It is not a one-size-fits-all type of situation in a conversation. And sometimes those conversations are one-on-one, sometimes they're group conversations, and you still have to understand that the identity of each person is an individual thing, and that in people speaking, they are telling you, in essence, who they are. They're writing a autobiography within the context of everything that they say. And it's your job as a listener to take that in and recognize the difference from person to person to person. And then the last concept of self-reflexivity, this course has taught me to think a lot about things like, how do I listen to other people? How do I listen with my entire being? How do I stay present in the process of listening? How can I be more effective as a listener? And how my listening can be an active form of dialogue. Listening isn't always about silent observation. It's about participating, being a part of something, and really being able to holistically take in absolutely everything that is being said and everything that you're experiencing in that moment, and then to hopefully go and do something positive with it. So thank you again for letting me ramble on a little bit, but I was trying to gather my thoughts, and it's been a wonderful course, and I really think that this will help me as a arts leader be a much more effective one, both with my board, my artists, and my staff, as well as a better teacher. So thank you so much, and stay in touch.